Hello, welcome back to Mr. Excalibur. I'm Arthur, and today we're looking at the first of three Balaur Arms swords that I'm going to be taking a look at. This is the first one that I've been able to get a hold of. For those of you who don't know anything about Balaur Arms is actually made in India, and they are solely distributed in the United States anyway by Cult of Athena. I'm not a representative of Cult of Athena, or for that matter Balaur Arms, but they just happen to be the only distributor out there that distributes this widely throughout the United States, presumably all of North America for that matter. Very interesting thing I'm going to start off with, and that is this. This sword is entirely too wiggly for me. I have to say though, it's pretty well built. It's very obvious to me that where they're going with this is they're getting into a price point that seldom other well-made European swords go. And that is saying something. When you start dipping into the world of European swords, we're looking at the low end around $300 with things from like Legacy Arms, Ronin Katana's European line, some of Cold Steel's European swords. All of these I'm going to be getting into throughout this year. And then of course you double that price range and now you're into Dark Sword Armory and stuff like that. And then of course you go to the far end, $1,000, $1,500 or so plus. Now you're into Arms and Armor and Albion, and those aren't for me. So I wanted to look at this. These are a very affordable set of swords. Balaur Arms, this is the first one. This is what they call their 13th/14th century sword. This is what's often referred to as a war sword, and some of you are going, okay, amongst the 1,000,001 variations of European swords, how many variants can there really be? This comes toward the end of the Crusader period, when they start really figuring out that they need to lighten up the blade and start lengthening the handle. And so that's just a really brief look at the history behind the sword. I've included some footage here of the one other person that I could find, at least as of this date, of someone who had done a review of the sword already. He really does a good job of going into the history of what, loosely anyway, this model is based upon. I'm going to look at this a little bit more from a practical point of view. The sword is hot peened. I think they probably could have done a better job putting a little bit more weight on the pommel. I understand that for purists out there, the pommel is not made as a counterbalance or anything like that, but it doesn't hurt. So my opinion is that when they built the sword, I think when they designed the sword, I think what they were trying to go for was by lightening up and really thinning up the blade by quite a bit comparison to other models that are just a little bit more expensive than this one. They were trying to get that price point really down. Now I will give them this. This is a nice scabbard. They did a darn good job. They've even got the ring indents, the ring reliefs on the scabbard, so you can put some kind of medieval-ish belt system around that. They've got the rain guard up here, nice thick leather. They've got a nice, easy, tip there at the bottom. I thought it was really nice, and that's saying something in a lot of when it comes to European swords, because when you talk about those higher end swords, you have to find someone who will virtually custom make a scabbard for you. Here's a sword for around $200 to $300, and they're giving you one, and it's a nice wood core scabbard. And check this out. Doesn't fall out. So for those of you who have that gripe with a lot of other products, I won't go into who they are, who say, the scabbards, are too loose. Not a problem here. You put it back in, no blade rattle at all. This is pretty nicely done. It's a nice overall package, I will say that, as far as the sword, a nice scabbard. Now, here's one interesting attribute of Balaur Arms that you do have to be aware of. Balaur Arms, like I said, come from India, and I don't know if there are some kind of trade relations between North American countries and India, but any bladed weapons that come from India have to be shipped over here blunt. That means when this arrives at Cult of Athena's Midwestern location, this sword is blunt. Now, as you guys will see in the unpacking footage and obviously in the cutting footage, this is not blunt. What happened? Well, quite honestly, the answer is Cult of Athena, as you may or may not know, does offer a sharpening service for dull models. Well, this does arrive to them dull. At about a week or so, I actually got this remarkably fast from Cult of Athena, even with the sharpening service added on. So I was actually impressed with how fast they got it. Now, there's a downside to this, and that is that the sharpening of the sword adds what's called a secondary bevel. Now, what that means is you have a flat grind here, but it's basically rounded at the top. And then what they do essentially is, when they grind this, if you look at this very closely, is if you've got that curvature of where it's been blunted at the top here, they basically grind here, grind there, and now you've got a secondary bevel, or what I call a knife edge, at the top. Now, what that's going to mean is that over time, that knife edge is going to wear down. And when you want to sharpen this thing again, it's going to mean a little bit more of an effort on your part to try and get it back to where it was, to where you're actually able to, cut through some material decently well. Now, the edge they put on this was pretty good. As you guys will see in the cutting footage, it did all right. My one big issue with this is the overall design of the sword, and that's this overly wobbly sword. This is something that has been pretty well documented in a number of other reviews on YouTube, considering a lot of Balaur Arms material. And, sorry, one of the hazards of being outside, you often have helicopters flying overhead. And so, but the overall shape, I really like how it feels, but this thing is really light. This thing is just a hair over 2 pounds. And I personally think that they cut the guard here a little bit too sharply, kind of cuts into the hand just a little bit. But it's a nice leather wrapped handle. They've got the ring, the ring segments here for some extra guard. It's got just enough thing for 2 hands to give you a good, powerful cut. But when when I was cutting with this thing, I could feel this thing just whip around. So if that doesn't bother you, this might actually be a pretty good option. There have been some rumors that suggest that Balaur Arms, or at least this line of European swords that Cult of Athena has come out with, is meant to kind of undercut companies like Dark Sword Armory. When people look at the scabbards, they see something that looks very reminiscent of what Dark Sword Armory gives with their swords, and yet you have a secondary bevel on the edge, but you also have slightly better fitting scabbard. That's something that Dark Sword Armory might want to actually take a look at. I'm actually a big fan of theirs, but this, for just over $200, is a pretty good deal. I mean, my own personal preference would be to get something a little bit more robust, a little bit heavier, a little bit sturdy of a blade. That's just my own thing. But for what you're getting, like I said, this is a pretty good deal. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the video. We've got, of course, all the normal segments, the unboxing, a little bit of look at what someone else has said about this, of course, my own cutting footage, and some data on the sword. I'm also including a little bit of a screencast footage here just to kind of let you guys see the information on Cult of Athena regarding Balaur Arms. So I hope this has been informative for you. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you guys next time. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the video. Bye-bye for now.
The unboxing for the Balaur Arms 13th to 14th century longsword is pretty straightforward. Again, this is a line of swords that is exclusively, at least as of the date that this video was put all together, a line exclusively offered through Cult of Athena. So that is who this came from. And as you guys can see, very simple packing paper shoved in the box, and then inside out comes the sword itself, wrapped in packing paper. No bubble wrap, no fancy printed packaging, no styrofoam. This just arrived straight from the manufacturer to Cult of Athena in that way. Now, I say that with some reservation, and this is something that I mentioned earlier in the summary that you guys have perhaps just seen. Well, let me take a minute here. I don't know how well that's really showing up on the camera, but obviously, you know, showing how much the blade wobbles quite a bit. Anyway, back to what I was saying. How it came to me may slightly be different. There it is, showing how flexible it is. How this sword came to me may be slightly different if you were to order it without getting it sharpened. Presumably, this arrived to Cult of Athena packed a certain way. They had to unpack it so that they could offer the service I am now demonstrating, showing how well it cuts. The sharpening service that Cult of Athena provided for this sword was actually pretty nice. It did put only a secondary bevel onto the sword, which I'm not that big of a fan of, but the edge they gave it was sharp. I mean, it was paper cutting sharp. I mean, did it shave it, you know, little sliver by sliver? No, but it definitely was very serviceable. There it is, kind of wagging again. So, back to how it was packed. How I got it may be slightly different because of the fact that it had to be unpacked by Cult of Athena, sharpened, and then repackaged and sent off to me. So that might be something to consider. But here's a nice overview of the sword right out of the all the packaging. It was only lightly oiled. The blade came inside the scabbard. There was no additional wrapping on the blade. Just kind of giving you a glance here at the hot painting. You know, all decent, really kind of construction attributes of the sword that had a nice, you know, that nice rain flap. You can see on the underside that it's backstitched along the back of the scabbard. So overall, coming right out of the box, the Balaur Arms 13th and 14th century longsword looked at least to be a pretty decent package per se, especially for the price point that they are offering it at. All right, here we're looking at Balaur Arms, and for those of you who may have started to see this crop up on different sword forums, they've been around for a couple years. This is essentially Cult of Athena's house brand of swords, and as you guys can see here, these are primarily European swords. We've got kind of the earlier medieval style swords, and then somewhat later period long swords. Even those are, these fit a little bit more into what would be considered war swords, as we'll be looking at the one today. Although we do have this one here, which is their 15th century Italian longsword. It's actually one that's in pretty high demand. I'm kind of interested in that one. And then, of course, they've got these Viking swords. Some more of some European style swords. Now, the interesting thing about Balaur Arms is they come from India. So let's take a look at the one that I ordered. As you guys can see here, price is pretty cheap. I mean, like I said, you know, under $200 here, of course, with shipping and everything. And then, of course, we've got the specs here. Now, the interesting part about these, as I was about to say, is that this is the result of them coming out of India. Now, I mentioned this in the kind of the initial summary of my experience with this particular one, the 13th and 14th century longsword. But this is the the official, and in order to get it sharpened, you have to pay a little extra through Cult of Athena to get them actually sharpened. Otherwise, they arrive dull. As you guys may have seen here, this is some information on the longsword itself. Just some additional. This is a sales video from them. I'm just gonna pause. I'm not gonna play the sound there. This was an earlier version of the sword. This is an early version of it, and he goes through just talking about the pluses and minuses. Of course, this guy is from Cult of Athena, so they are obviously, you know, look at this from a sales point of view. In his hand, obviously, there it has not been sharpened. And I don't know if at some point he goes through just kind of showing how it's balanced. So just a little bit about what Cult of Athena actually has there on about here. But this is the primary interesting feature, that is, it comes not sharpened. So you have to get them sharpened through Cult of Athena. I wanted to include this clip from Dynamo Sword Channel's review of this sword, mainly because I really wanted to kind of promote what he's been talking about here. You'll see that he introduces some imagery of some of the oakshot typology that this sword is roughly based upon. He goes on to refer this as a war sword from this era. Obviously a period, you know, kind of just predating what we imagine to be the classic long sword, where the blades are still a little heavy, but the handles are starting to get a little bit longer. He also goes into the very familiar subject of the wobbly nature of the blades, and you know, he gives it a good, you know, wobble too, as you can see. To him, that was acceptable. To him, he thought that was all right. And quite honestly, throughout his entire review, overall, he has the same basic assessment as I do of the sword, as far as its functionality, its design, its build, with regard to its price point. So it's nice to see that there is a consensus of two so far on this particular design. The handling and performance of the Balaur Arms 13th to 14th century longsword was somewhat of a unique experience. This sword is very light. From what I understand, many of their models that are similar to this, as far as length and build, are very light. But they are light to the point where the blade almost feels like it whips around. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because it whips around and almost creates an unstable feeling when wielding this sword. You can see just how much it bends just from me wiggling around like that. Now, for some people, quite honestly, they may look at that and say, well, that may have actually been the actual dynamics of this period of sword, where the steel was, these things didn't weigh, a ton. Well, in reality, they did have a pretty decent heft to them. Real examples show us that they did have a pretty significant amount of mass to them. Now, the reason why they may be making this model lighter is it's less material and therefore cheaper. This thing really moved around pretty fast, though. I have to admit, the edge that Cult of Athena put on it was pretty good and did a pretty decent job of cutting these bottles up. He even tried a nice over the head bang. Cut the thing, right in half. Whoop! Just like that. Trying here a bit of a combination move where we get 1, 2, 3 and bump the box. Glad it isn't the ladder anymore. So I would have smacked that sword. So anyway, this was a fun sword to swing around. I will give it that. But there were some moments where it was hard to kind of tell where the blade actually was because it had so much whip to it. And that was where I thought it had some disadvantage. Here, of course, though, is the strength of European swords. You put a decent edge on them, and this is what you do. You plow it into things, and just the mass of the blade does the work, does the rest. And there's the testament to it. That's hardened cardboard that I've used for a couple tests now. I think I've just about used it up. But the interesting thing about that stuff is that it can actually damage swords. So just, beware that this is, these are swords that I've bought, and so I'm risking it by doing it. But those really are the strengths of European swords most of the time, where they just can plow through that particular material, even though the finer points may not be quite as good. But remember to always lubricate the sword so you have them to play with on another day.